Rage Badger Gaming here, and today we're going to take a little deviation away from Gloomhaven to talk about another system, Dungeons & Dragons. So Dungeons & Dragons has been a prevalent game in the RPG community for some time, and we're currently on its 5th edition, including a little bit of sidetrack editions like 3.5, and then they had some separation between Dungeons & Dragons and Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. The whole point is we're on 5th edition now, and it's been seeing a soaring rise in popularity, partly due to the Matt Mercer effect and other the popularization of Critical Role and other D&D related content. Regardless of why, it's definitely a force in today's culture, especially in the gaming community. However, as with any community, there is a lot of opinions and there is quite a bit of division. 5th edition is, without a doubt, the most popular edition of Dungeons & Dragons to date. Statistically, you just can't find anything to say that any of the other editions even came close. But you'll still find people who are like, hey, let's have a nice little throwback to, old school rules, or like, playing 1st or 2nd edition, or even reviving, some of the other ones, or having reversions of it, like Dungeon Crawl Classics, which are a big throwback. Some people play, a 3rd edition still, or a variant of that, Pathfinder 1st edition. The 2nd edition is clearly a deviation away from that 3rd or 3.5. And then, of course, you have the most divisive, most off-course, brilliantly strategic, and of all the versions of D&D we've ever seen, and that being its 4th edition. So everyone knows I love Gloomhaven, and I also love D&D 4th edition, but I do think it missed the mark in several areas. And I think a well-run 4th edition campaign could be very close to like a well-run Gloomhaven campaign. And there's a lot of similarities between like tactical miniatures play over a grid, and it's interesting to see how these videos being done like from myself and other content creators on Gloomhaven, when I think 4th edition could have had the same following, but it just missed the mark. So why did it flop, and why is it so, at least understandably, maligned? It comes down to just a few things: familiarity, marketing, and available content that was available on launch. I do think that with a few changes, it could actually still have a significant following today. I do think, however, at the time, there was a bit of a brand on Dungeons & Dragons that was like the normie crowd game, and a lot of the more elite tactical players preferred to play other games, and the normies thought this was, too far of a stretch for 3rd edition, that they didn't accept it. So kind of both communities just pushed it away, and I think it could have had a much better reception with a few changes. It ends up now kind of being the butt of all these jokes, and it's certainly not a system without faults. It has so many of them. I'm going to be talking about them here. So we're going to dissect how we got to this point. So let's get into the evolution of Dungeons & Dragons. So how did we get here? I can't really speak much about 1st edition, having only some retroactively looked into it, but 2nd edition D&D is kind of where I started, with the 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Player's Guide, and getting all these at once and starting my own campaign. We didn't have a dungeon master. I didn't even know anyone who played, so I just became the DM and started running that for people. And it was really fun, honestly. But here's the thing, you've got some pretty core concepts that made it, this is Dungeons & Dragons. So when 3rd edition came on, it didn't feel like a huge stretch. So my players were like, hey, we should try this 3rd edition out because it seems really good. So what did 2nd edition have and 3rd edition have that really kind of helped that evolution? Well, 2nd edition, of course, had, the attributes: strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, charisma. They actually had like Thaco. I don't think the community has ever really decided on which one's correct. I'm pretty sure there's videos out there that's confirmed one or the other, but anyway, that's beside the point, which really just turned into base attack bonus. Anyone who's familiar with Thaco was like, oh, base attack bonus is just Thaco. It is. It had saving throws, even though they're a little bit different, like we have fortitude, reflex, and willpower, instead of like, here's save versus breath weapon, save versus death, save versus petrification, save versus wand. It's like, what if it's a wand of petrification? Anyway, the whole point is, is the saving throws got a little bit more aligned, and you took all these like non-weapon proficiencies and fit them into this very bloated skill system. And you see a lot of these things carried over to 5th edition, that the stats stayed the same. Skills, although seeing more of the 2nd edition throwback of non-weapon proficiencies coming more from a background perspective. Base attack bonus was kind of like the proficiency bonus, and a whole bunch of other things that just kind of took from these 2nd and 3rd edition, but also took a lot from 4th. But the idea of moving from 2nd to 3rd, you had all these similarities that felt distinctly familiar. All the classes from the 2nd edition core book made it over into 3rd edition, and they added a few. The sorcerer, the barbarian, and the monk, which isn't necessarily new, but they were certainly added to the core list of classes. So any of the ones who wanted to play the 8 classes that appeared in 2nd edition Dungeons & Dragons could at least play it again in the launch of 3rd edition. And not only that, but 3rd edition really broadened the amount of classes that were available at the time anyway. 5th edition launched with a similar number of classes, expanding it a little bit to include, the Warlock, because that was popularized with 3.5, and of course 4th edition, where it really kind of hit its stride. And 5th edition is not super unique as a system. It doesn't really bring anything that we hadn't really seen before, beyond the fact that it's just super streamlined. 5th edition is kind of like an amalgamation of all the other editions. So from going from 2nd to 3rd, we saw some of the core things translate over a little bit differently. We got feats, and feats have been something that I don't necessarily think was handled super well in 3rd edition, and especially 4th edition. There are certain feats that were statistically powerful, like weapon focus. It was really hard not to take it, but it was kind of boring. But it's kind of hard to say why not take it, because statistically you're going to be performing better in combat. So what a 4th edition, once we go from 3rd to 4th, what did it have that had that evolution? Of course, the attributes stayed the same. It had instead of saving throws, it had defenses, but it still had fortitude, reflex, and willpower. They still had armor class and hit points, which has been in 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th. Not too different. 4th edition handled it way differently. Instead of rolling a die, and 4th edition standardized you must use the point buy, but you can roll as an alternate. That pivot there was another core thing. I think that kind of divided some players, because I don't think point buy was necessarily super popular at the time in 3rd edition, although with time it seems to have become significantly more appropriate, which I think is ironic given how that kind of started in 4th edition, which is certainly one of the more maligned ones. 5th edition is a very tight edition in terms of what you can do and kind of how it handles it. It's like, hey, are you going to do this and you get an advantage? You get advantage. This sounds hard, disadvantage. Set these difficulties at scaling things without the, nuance of what kind of action do you want to do. So that's where all the evolution really breaks down. 2nd edition had very, very specific things, like only rogues can do these things, and here's their percent of doing it. And then they have these really big breakdowns of like what percentage they have to succeed at the task. And then also even non-rogue stuff between the non-weapon proficiencies and some of the other non-combat actions. Here are all these, how they are handled. And 3rd edition faithfully took all these and tried to add their own. Because 3rd edition had like, I want to run into that guy. Like, what do you want to do? Like, what do you mean I want to run into him? Like, do you want to like tackle him and grab him? Do you want to run into him like and try to knock him off the edge? Do you want to run into him like try to knock him to the floor? Do you want to run into him to knock the weapon out of his hand? And they're like, oh yeah, one of those. Well, which one? Because we have rules set for each of them. And like, holy shit, why are all of them so diverse? And 5th edition's like, hey, here's one thing we're going to do to kind of cover all that in a catch-all. 3rd edition had so much things of like, for every specific thing, here's a rule for it, which 2nd edition had. Now so 5th edition kind of had you can do all that, but it's a catch-all. 4th edition had much more restrictions of, you can do that, but you need powers to do these things. So we have openness, narrowness, and openness. And that narrowness, I think, is really what turned a lot of people off. Because it's like, I want to push people. Like, well, you can, but you're kind of going to have a really weak action. But some people just get powers where they can push at will. Like the fighter's Tide of Iron from 4th edition's at will abilities, which is a really very powerful at-will power, honestly. It gave you a lot of battlefield control, especially paired with some of the fighter's passive abilities. Although it was necessarily powerful and fun people don't necessarily want that. They want a lot of freedom, and that's kind of where 4th edition lost a bit of it, and that's kind of what people wanted in an edition of Dungeons and Dragons. And I know that we're talking about all these very specific things, but it reminds me a lot of like Elder Scrolls, where we have Daggerfall, which is largely regarded as, of course, it was like, at the time, it was such a good game. Daggerfall is great. And like, well, do you go back and play it? And most people are like, oh, no, of course I don't. It's certainly paved the way for Morrowind, which some people absolutely do go back to and play a lot. I know still people play Daggerfall. I've played Daggerfall recently, but it's certainly not popular, and it's only a smaller part of the audience who plays Elder Scrolls that join it. But however, at least it's regarded with some positivity. Now that's where we move on to, so we've got the Morrowind and like the darling of 3rd edition, and the really super bloated Pathfinder, which we won't get into for this. So 4th edition, kind of the evolution, could you imagine, like some people were shell-shocked with Skyrim, where they're like, where are my attributes? Where are my things? And some people were really taken aback when Skyrim hit. I'm not necessarily saying that Skyrim is 4th edition, but the removal and downscaling turned some players off, some immediately. I literally saw some comments about how like on the first week, how like I had to return the game because where are my RPG elements? And that's kind of where it fell short, because some people wanted to play Elder Scrolls, but they wanted familiarity. And that's the big thing here. 4th edition fails the familiarity test. And the interesting part is it does so much well, like balance is so great. 3rd edition's balance was so far off, like favoring even like the fighter, which is very powerful at low levels but scales poorly later. And this casters, which, I mean, first off, cleric being super powerful at all levels is ridiculous. And having casters get to some insane levels of power over time is just, that's not great. Like we need a far better way to balance the system. And 2nd edition, 3rd edition both handled that super poorly. 4th edition had such a good streamline of power, but people don't necessarily want streamlined power and balance. They want familiarity. So that's one of the reasons why 4th edition is a poor system of Dungeons and Dragons, but not necessarily a poor game. The release was incomplete, the branding was off because it just wasn't familiar enough to people. The healing surges were like, hey, I'm gonna cast healing word on you, thanks. And like I lost a healing surge, like wait, so we're gonna go through this whole dungeon and eventually you're just gonna be unhealable with my spells? Yep. Now, this is actually a really good mechanic because sometimes, especially, late game clerics who can just have a nearly unlimited amount of healing, it now means you have a resource to manage, which is great because you now start to get a little bit of fear. You start to go like, oh, maybe we shouldn't go do that. Maybe we should. You feel quite mortal knowing that there is a limited amount, or you play differently, more tactically to know like, I can't take these hits. We can get healed, sure. Even mid-encounter, we're gonna get plenty of heals, but we may not have, there's only so much beating I can take over the course of a day. And that was actually a great system, but it felt very gamey. It felt artificial, and some people felt like it detached them from the game. And that break in immersion was far more of a backlash than, trying to balance the game out. And for 5th edition, there's a limited number from hit dice, but at the very least, hit dice is kind of like a supplement where the cleric can still keep on throwing healing spells on you, but you also have other ways to do it, which is such a good carryover from 4th edition. And I know some people are like, yeah, it's great that we don't need to get a healer. 5th edition's great. I mean, honestly, 4th edition had that too, and that's another carryover that is really well done. But also, not limiting the other classes' abilities to heal you is a really good way that 5th edition handles it. So that's just one example. Another thing where 4th edition really falls off on the mark is customization by class. Some people want to be like, hey, I want to be a dwarf wizard, cool. I'm going to be kind of tanky and I want to do this, I'm going to wear armor. Like, wait, what are you doing? I'm going to wear some armor because I'm a mountain dwarf. I'm going to be tanky because I'm going to take these spells. And people are like, oh shit, you've got a really weird build with your wizard. 4th edition were like, hey, are you a wizard? Cool, you're a controller. Hey, are you a fighter? What, you're a defender. Like, I kind of want to like dual wield and tice them to pieces. Like, okay, but you're still going to be a tank. And then people are like, I want to be a dual wielder. Like, well, there are classes that will dual wield. Pick one of those and you'll be better at it. Of course, as 4th edition released on, there were more options, and that's another thing. But the fact that every class was pigeonholed into roles was such a detachment of familiarity that that's another reason why it failed. I actually love the system of defender, striker, leader, and controller. I think it's fantastic, but it's not Dungeons and Dragons. It's something very different. It's something very good, but it's something very different. And the fact that we've already had like different, it's no surprise that 4th edition is so heavily maligned by the community. 4th edition didn't have the luxury of these like build options. Like now, of course, you could like say, hey, I'm building a paladin. Oh, how are you building your paladin? You can go a little bit more like the leadery role. Give some support to your group. You could actually go heavy on damage and get some more of that support. You could actually go full on like defender and just say, I'm just going to do that. And there are actually some controller powers in there too. But in the end, you were a defender and you only could really dabble in some of the other areas. Now, of course, they're like, well, in the 5th edition, you can't really play a paladin full support, and that's true. But there's still much of a broader range of how you can handle the classes in 5th edition, and especially in 3rd. And I think it's very interesting, Gloomhaven has the same thing. Like, you don't have like melee, striker, tinkerers, or like, hey, I'm a healer brute. You're pigeonholed into what your role is by your class, and you stick to it. That works because Gloomhaven didn't try to advertise itself as Dungeons and Dragons in Gloomhaven, new campaign setting. It said, we're Gloomhaven, we're a new system. And that's the kind of marketing that sets it aside. Of course, Gloomhaven is way different than Dungeons and Dragons, and I think 4th edition could have served from a marketing of having a different bit of marketing, which will get us into that point. So imagine instead of saying, hey, this is D&D 4th edition, imagine we get into, this is Dungeons & Dragons Tactics. For example, we actually had the Dungeons & Dragons miniatures game, the skirmish game that was released in between 3rd and 4th. They didn't say, this is Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition. They said, this is Dungeons & Dragons, the skirmish game. I actually forget the name. But you played with these little miniatures. You used D&D, like a very familiar system. They're like, hey, these are the 3rd edition stats. Although every hit point's divisible by 5. They're like, wait, that's not Dungeons & Dragons. The whole point is it was branded so differently that people didn't give a shit that it wasn't exactly Dungeons & Dragons. It was a different game. And people knew it was a different game. And that is why it actually got accepted. And it was pretty heavily favored for a while. Not only that, but you could use the miniatures for your Dungeons & Dragons campaign. So it kind of served a dual purpose, especially for some people. Now, the role-playing game community was still a little bit more of the like, haha, nerds play it. And Dungeons & Dragons was still a bit of the casual culture at the time. So we didn't have this big thing we have. So a lot more of the tactics and strategy players didn't want to jump into Dungeons & Dragons. They wanted to stick to their own games. Because who wants to play the normie popular game? The gatekeeping in the community, which is a problem in so many communities, led a lot of people not even to try 4th edition. And it's interesting to see on like the forums how much division there were, because people are like, I proudly play this game. And especially within Dungeons & Dragons, the Wizards forums was like, I am a proud 3rd edition Dungeon Master. Great. Some people literally made that as a way of defiance against 4th edition. And I'm like, this kind of hostility is not helpful to the community, but really, they could have branded it like they did the miniatures game. Pick it something. Dungeons & Dragons Tactics. Chainmail, like revised. Tactical Studies Rules, new edition. Anything that wasn't Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition. That's where they killed themselves. Some people are like, well, we can't role play. The interesting part is D&D 4th edition introduced skill challenges, which I've heard a lot of people like, I love 5th edition skill challenges. Like, oh, great, that's a 4th edition thing, not a 5th. It's a carryover, because skill challenges was such a great development for 4th edition. And rituals and some of these non-combat spells were kind of put into these very interesting, and they had a whole Dungeon Master guide. And I actually am certainly convinced by listening to some of the subreddits, YouTube comments, and forums, all these things, I don't think people read the new Dungeon Master guide when every new edition comes out. Some people aren't aware of some of the rules of 5th edition, and I think a lot of people didn't read the 4th edition DM guide on how to handle a lot of these non-combat stuff, or how to handle like travel and all these other things. And it was fun. we had a little bit of variance to obviously adapt to the new system, the new skills, and other things. But I didn't change and say hey, the 4th edition is a combat system. We're going to have combat all the time. I had about the same balance as combat, non-combat. And I think some people are so hyper-fixated on how gamey the powers looked, because they were. The powers, the wizard, which used to have 1 billion spells, were saying hey, you barely have more powers than the fighter. And the power fighter, who usually was hey, what are my attack? Well, you have basic attack. Okay, I'm good. And they were actually fine with just having basic attack. Honestly, 5th edition still suffers from that, where some of the classes are very boring, and Pathfinder suffered from that too. But Pathfinder 2nd edition really takes a big improvement in that regard, drastically improving the amount of actions you can take. The action economy is way better in it. But 5th edition still suffers from that. 4th edition did not, however, naming every power. So if I wanted to play World of Warcraft, I just play World of Warcraft. Well, this isn't World of Warcraft. It's an entirely different thing. But the fact that everything Heroic Strike, Charge, Rend, Thunderclap, the fact that they had all these named powers that Tide of Iron, Cleave, Brute Strike, Second Wind, and all these things are it felt like you were playing a video game. And I think for some people that was another thing of how the immersion was broken. But again, that's because it was unfamiliar to Dungeons and Dragons. Now, this actually makes for a better game overall, because some people do try other systems solely because some of the classes get very tedious to play. Now, of course, some of the casters have the luxury of being able to change their turn almost every time to be hey, I have these many different cantrips I can change at will that all serve different purposes. I have these many spells that I can pull out for, these for utility, these are for combat, and they still have that luxury. But that's something every class had in 4th edition. And that really separated it from all the other editions of Dungeons & Dragons. Now, some people are well, as a ranger, level 1 ranger, you just twin strike a lot, except for a couple times in an encounter you do something different. Yeah, you had a few things that you did a little bit differently, but the ranger largely did a twin strike spam. But it still had, I'm going to hunter's mark that guy, I'm going to kill it over there, and then I'm going to remark this other guy over here. And then as you hit level 2, 6, you started to get more utility powers, some of which you could do at will, or some of which every encounter you could pull off. And then at level 3, you start to get another encounter power. So now you have, over the course of what it was normally a 10-round battle, the halftime where Twin Strike only comes up on certain turns. And that really made play a lot better. So of course level 1 play is going to be a little bit more rudimentary, but as you start leveling up in 4th edition, it became so much more of a tactics game. But as you leveled up, you had to get all these feats, and this suffers the 3rd and 4th edition mandatory feats problem. Mandatory feats are kind of on the, not necessarily part of familiarity, but a problem in 4th edition. A lot of people who played 4th were well, clearly you're going to pick this feat because it's too good. I need this, or the enemy's defenses are scaling too fast. I need to pick weapon expertise to just keep up. Now, a lot of this I remedied by saying, hey, these mandatory feats, you get them for free. Pick this one and this one of those in that group, and you get it for free. And people were okay, cool. And then you could pick some of the more flavorful or fluffy feats, and that was fine. 3rd edition, I didn't really create that remedy, but 3rd edition and 4th edition both kind of had that problem where the feat design felt like it was a way to compete with the system and not actually picking fluff. 5th edition takes a big deviation there, which should be almost like a lack of familiarity. However, it feels good because you can pick the thing where this feat is awesome, and 5th edition feats are awesome, but you get way less compared to other editions. So 4th edition, taking feats and doing that, they felt gamey. Now, 3rd edition feats often felt a little gamey too, because some of them were clearly too powerful. But some of the rest of the 3rd edition system didn't feel too gamey, and everything on 4th felt gamey, to the point where now the feats were such a hyper-focused part of it. Not only that, but items in 4th edition became a part of scaling. Now, of course, in 3rd edition, items became super important to scaling some of the later things, but 4th edition, it was critical at all levels to kind of have a plus X version of a weapon so you could at least compete with actually being able to hit enemies. And enemy defenses scaled so harshly in 4th edition that you kind of needed to min-max to keep up with them, or take these min-max feats, and you kind of felt well, this feat sounds fun, but I can't fit it in, and that's a problem by design. 5th edition has too many good feats, but they all feel fun and worthy, and none of them feel like, well, I need to take that to compete. You already feel like you're competitive with the monsters, and the feats feel more impactful. And this is a fault of 4th edition and 3rd editions that I ultimately think 5th edition remedied, and that makes 5th edition different than the other editions. So really, it's just a bit of bad marketing, and it's just the evolution that led it to this point, and familiarity that fell off. But it's not just those. It's the available content that would happen on the 4th edition's release that really, really shot itself in the foot. Like I said, 4th edition released with 8 classes, but so did 2nd. However, there are some people who got attached to some of their favorite classes in 3rd that had to wait months for rules on how to play them. So, but by that point, it's too late. People want to jump in and convert their campaign and say like, all right, so how do I do this? And they're like, well, here's a very gamey system where you can't be a bard. Like, wait, I can't be a bard? Like, no, that's going to be in 4 months. That was already enough. 4 months is enough people to make enough time that people made an opinion and said, screw this, I'm out. And by the time the bard and the sorcerer and the barbarian and the monk came along, people were already too detached from the system. And that's bad. The problem is, why did they stick to so few classes? Since every class required all these powers from every level, all these paragon classes from these levels, and all these abilities, it was just so much to fit into one rule book that they had to pick and choose which classes made the cut. And that was a problem. 4th edition requires so many options to be viable, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It just means that when they released, there wasn't much. Now you're like, well, that sounds like it's got a big case of bloat then, if you have to have all these books. But no, because you were kind of, you're limited by the amount of slots. Like, so you're a fighter, you have 2 at-will powers. Well, adding another of at-will powers, unless they're clearly much, much better than other at-will powers, you're not going to get super bloated characters. You're not going to get these like combinations of what you can do in 3rd and 5th, where you can like level dip in some class, just take these, move into another class, and so on and so forth. 4th edition really limited what you could do, so adding more just gave you more options. Now, of course, with some of these option combinations, you could come up with more powerful characters, but there was a pretty clear limit. And depending on your party, some of these powers ended up being synergizing very well. Some of them opened up way new build paths, and it was just very good to see this as soon as, all the splat books came out for all the, different power sources, like martial power, arcane power, and so on and so forth. And just being able to kind of have the complete fighter for 4th edition, but instead of completely adding some super broken combos where you could dip into this, and make super powerful characters, you actually just broadened what you could do, and it felt like the whole thing opened up, and there were so many builds. But that was, again, too little, too late. The amount of content available at release was not great. The amount they provided a lot of fun tools, but it really fell short. People had already made their opinions, and people had already drawn the lines in the sand. Some people already said, I'm never touching 4th edition. And when the 5th edition playtesting started, what surprised me is they're like, hey, here's the new edition, test out these rules, and then here's the feedback form. And I saw some things where I'm like, oh, this came back from 4th, people are gonna hate it. And I went onto the forums, and some people are like, wow, I like hit dice, I like these skill challenges. And you see these people who are like, as long as it's not like 4th, I'll be good. I'm like, oh, you are really praising some 4th edition shit. But the thing is, that's not what they didn't like. They didn't like the lack of, you're like, here are the amount of powers you have. This little bitty thing. Here are the amount of spells your wizard can take. It's such a smaller thing. Magic missiles sucked. Magic missiles sucked, first off. Don't ever release an edition where magic missile sucks. Wizards are going to flip the out. But they're like, hey, here's a bard. Wait, I can play as a bard on release? Already a big bonus. There's so many people who are just attached to bards. So it had everything people wanted off the bat, to the point where they were like, okay, the amount of content that's available, the amount of familiarity, and this is marketed in a way that this is the new edition of Dungeons and Dragons. The thing is, for a while, they were hesitant to even call it that. Like, D&D Next was what it was kind of like called online for a while, because I think Wizards was afraid to call it 5th edition for the longest time because of what happened with 4th. Because this but ultimately 5th edition became a very successful and faithful following of what it is to be a Dungeons & Dragons game. So really, all I've been doing is saying, wow, this is why 4th edition sucks, but earlier in the video, I heard you say that 4th edition is your favorite edition of Dungeons & Dragons. No, it's my favorite edition of Dungeons & Dragons as a game, but it's not what I run now, and I think it's one of the best role-playing systems. So, what did 4th edition do right, and why should you consider playing it? You shouldn't necessarily consider playing it. However, I think people need to be informed at what it did correctly. So, after we have a few releases, actually by the time you only had, 5 bonus books, just 5 books, which is interesting because by the time 3.5 fixed a lot of the 3rd edition books, most people had purchased the Player's Handbook and all the other books and then have to buy them all again. 3 more books, to the point where most people had more than 4th edition required to be, in my opinion, successfully run with all the options that are necessary to make it the most enjoyable experience. So 4th edition as a miniatures combat RPG is incredible. Like I said, if it was branded like Dungeons & Dragons Tactics, it would be great. Giving classes roles is incredible. This allows you to give stack powerful abilities. Well, the fact that you can't dip into another class to get its main ability means that you can front load it and say hey, at level 1 you get this really strong ability, and that's a problem because in 5th edition they're hey, at level 1 you get this strong ability. Cool, I'm taking 1 level in that class and moving on. They're please don't do that, because now you're no, I'm doing it. Do you want to hear my cool smiting warlock? Wait, why are you smiting? I'm a paladin warlock. I'm going all on charisma. Well, you need more spell slots to run that. Well, I'm a sorcerer too. Oh, Jesus Christ, what the f is this amalgamation of a character? You can do this shit. It doesn't matter. But 4th edition said hey, we're going to limit you so you can actually have these impactful things without necessarily breaking the system. There's little YouTube channels where you can see the most broken ass builds in 5th edition because of what front-loading classes does. So now that front-loading classes isn't a thing for 4th, or it is, but you don't suffer a penalty for it. This allows you to have some cool things like the Divine Judgment from the Paladin, or having the Spellbook feature on the Wizard, allowing you to swap out your daily powers and having way more options, which is great for the Wizard. Now, it's still less than the other editions, but still giving that familiarity of saying here are my list of abilities, and I can pick and choose depending on the day on what I want. Not only that, but Ritual Caster kind of gave you the ability to have that spellbook feel and still bring utility powers. So that's another thing, the utility powers. The Ritual Caster and skill challenges. 4th edition did so well because you can get to a point where it's hey, you're now at this door and it's locked. Well, we don't have someone who can pick the lock. You can say well, I can pick the lock, but it's just instead of relying on one die roll, hey, I rolled a 1. What do we do now? You actually were roll multiple times, and not only it added tension, you get another success, roll again. You have another success, roll again. And it actually built tension for having that. Also, it meant that one bad roll didn't just kind of fuck up your whole thing. But also you could do cool things they allowed athletics to be used way more in combat than just, because sometimes people were why am I taking climb? But funneling them down into skill groups made them more useful. And then allowing you to have these knowledges hey, you can literally learn raw game data scan or some of those things in Final Fantasy where you're I want to scan that monster and figure out what I can do against it. The knowledge just worked like that. And it was cool to have a system where your skills paid off, and you could design challenges around what skills your characters had. So skill challenges really brought around a better way to actually quantify how to handle skills and being able to reward players for a very broad set of hey, you want to do this? Roll this, then this many successes before this many failures. Hey, I want to have these cool things. And they actually set up a lot of examples in the Dungeon Master Guide, hey, you're traveling long distances, you'll need to do these kind of survival checks, and this is what could possibly happen, and set up ways to guide your campaign around success and failure guiding towards different paths, or here are the penalties for failure, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're stopped and you can't do it. So they designed towards using a group of skills to go over these obstacles. that's nice. And that's a lot of what people overlooked in 4th edition. But what people didn't overlook was the combat. And I think that's where it really shined. Having like built-in push effects that actually felt very good, because you had like static area of effect stuff where like, hey, I need to get these people grouped together. Or like, hey, I'm gonna, like the fighter who could like opportunity attack and stop people from moving. And you had this semblance of control over combat. Like, you felt like you could actually tank, which was interesting. 3rd edition, it felt like, hey, I'm running towards that guy, I'm gonna hit it. And like, okay, I'm gonna go hit the wizard now. Like, no, but I insulted its mother and I hit it. Congrats. That doesn't do shit though. There's no quantifiable rule or mechanic that says that target must suffer a penalty because of something your fighter, barbarian, or paladin did. So that's one of the things that 4th edition actually gives defenders some form of control for tanking. It gives leaders the ability to heal every combat without like, I'm running out of healing. Now, of course, you could run out of healing surges, but you never ran out of healing spells. Every time a new combat came around, you had healing word or, inspiring word or all the other ones back. You have these recharges, so you always felt like you could contribute to the party. And, you had the strikers, which all had some mechanic that rewarded you, like, hey, I'm gonna quarry that guy over there. And then that made rangers focus fire on, I'm gonna kick the shit out of that guy. Or rogues, which introduced the 5th edition sneak attack mechanic where they expect you to sneak attack every round to compete with the other strikers or damage dealers. And then, of course, it introduced the controller role, which is great with the way it dealt with like minions having 1 health, but generally good defenses. So how did all this end up stacking up? We had a very well played 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons like combat system where you could combine all of these and have very well done miniatures combat. It's possibly one of the best RPG, combat systems I've ever. And I played Gloomhaven. And I think 4th edition handles it better over the course of a campaign in terms of a role-playing game, tactical game. Now, of course, Gloomhaven does strategy on a whole new level, but it's certainly not a role-playing game. But for all its faults, 4th edition is a great system, but unfortunately not necessarily a great Dungeons and Dragons system. I do hope, however, that there can be some sort of revival. I know some people like old school rules. Revived kind of like old school versions of Dungeons and Dragons. Like take Dungeon Crawl Classics, which kind of takes some of the original versions of 1st edition and streamlined it to a newer game, rebranded it, and now it's gaining a following. Now it's still not very big, but the whole point is 1st edition, no one would even think of playing it, but people will at least consider playing Dungeon Crawl Classics. If 4th edition could have some sort of revival like that, I think we could see 4th edition coming around and people picking it up and saying, hey, this is a pretty fun game, as long as they call it anything but Dungeons and Dragons. So I've almost considered, and at least a couple times playtested, kind of coming up with a new game that's basically 4th edition but rebranded with a little bit of nuances to say like, hey, we're not even trying to be Dungeons and Dragons, we're just going to be a RPG battle tactics game. And I think ultimately, if someone who can actually finish projects, I have a problem where I leave a lot of projects incomplete, but if someone could actually do that, it would be wonderful to see what we can do to bring 4th edition D&D's style of combat and style of handling encounters to the community. And that's something I just love to see, and I'd love to see actually how the board game and role-playing game community embrace that. So ultimately, if you hated it or loved it, 4th edition is certainly something, it's either well praised or maligned or the butt of the jokes. There's so many YouTube channels that use 4th edition as like the punchline of a lot of jokes, and that's completely understandable given everything. So wherever you stand on it, it certainly had a big impact on the community, and it certainly had an impact on the design of 5th edition in terms of them learning, all right, how do we make 5th edition something that's familiar and marketable as D&D, and what is the minimum amount of content that we can give to the players that they're not upset at what's available on launch. And 5th edition wildly succeeded where 4th edition failed, because they managed to do all those check marks that made Dungeons and Dragons a D&D game. I hope you enjoyed this. I might include some more rants. If you have some inspiration, shoot them in the comments and I'll read them, and we'll see if I can get around to that. Right now I'm still trying to revise some of the Gloomhaven starters, so I'll probably be doing that more. Thanks to our patrons. You're the guys keeping this channel running. Thank all of you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and you're all amazing.